So, welcome to another episode of Maktisi Street. We're delighted to have with us today Dr. Assal Rad, who is a historian of the modern Middle East and a non resident fellow at the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. Assal works on research and writing related to U.S. foreign policy issues. Her writing has appeared in many major sort of mainstream and alternative media forums: BBC, Al Jazeera, Foreign Policy, Newsweek, CNN, NPR. She is a PhD from the University of California, Irvine, and she's the author of The State of Resistance, Politics, Culture, and Identity in Modern Iran, which came out in 2022. Asal probably is most famous for those of us who follow her on Twitter or on X for the way she started redrawing or recrafting the headlines of the New York Times to indicate precisely how it is that the New York Times and other major sort of Western mainstream papers and outlets were sort of obscuring what was happening in Gaza. And she was very much to the point. And so, Asal, welcome to our show. It's great to have you with us. And I guess the first question we have for you is, what gave you the idea to do that, to sort of recraft those headlines in the way that you have been doing for now at least 2 years?
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. It's funny because I actually started doing the headline corrections before the Gaza genocide. So it wasn't something that I started with the Gaza genocide, but then that's when it gained a lot of traction because obviously of the gravity of the situation, how egregious the atrocities we were seeing every day were. And so we've seen an entire shift in the public narrative and the public perception of the Palestinian issue. And I don't call it the Israel-Palestinian conflict because it's not a conflict. It is a question of Palestinian liberation and the fact that Israel is an occupying force. And that in and of itself, that like very basic framing is what has always been missing in the Western narrative. And that's why the sort of headline corrections that I had done predate the Gaza genocide. Ultimately, what I've been trying to show is that the narrative in the West is curated. While we talk about this idea of a free press, the idea that the freedom of the press is a cornerstone of democracy in the Western world, the purpose of it, the difference between a free press and a state press, or what we would call a state press under an authoritarian government, is that a free press is supposed to challenge the government. It's not supposed to be a mouthpiece for the government, or not their own governments or others. And yet, what major legacy media has done in the West, from the New York Times, Associated Press, Reuters, BBC, and you can keep going, is they treat statements from the Israeli government, especially, as fact, and they cast doubt on anything that Palestinian witnesses, Palestinian journalists, Palestinian doctors, just anyone on the ground, their narratives, their stories, you cast out, and then the state actually carrying out a genocide, everything they say is treated as fact. And you can see the subtlety in the language when you just look at the headline and when you do these very small corrections, because that's the difference of using language that dehumanizes Palestinians or doesn't even name Palestinians versus, adding the identity Palestinian to the victims, calling them victims, naming the aggressor. Who is the entity that is killing Palestinians? Israel. And it's doing so on a mass scale and deliberately. So that was what was missing in the way that the framing existed, and that's what I was trying to point out.
So also, if I could ask just as the follow up to that question, I mean, now we're now over. I think we're over 660 or so. I can't remember how many days of this extraordinary genocide, this unprecedented mass slaughter of children, of people, of civilians in Gaza. What has surprised you, or what do you think has changed in the mainstream media coverage? You said there's been a shift. Is the shift? Are you talking about the public opinion shift? Are you talking about something else? What has changed, or what has surprised you about the mainstream coverage over this period where it's no longer? I mean, there's no pretense anymore about what's happening in Gaza.
There's definitely a public perception shift. We know that based on polling. Anecdotally, you can see the way that there is engagement on social media. And so the public perception, and this is the case in the United States, which is quite important because the US is Israel's number one supporter. I mean, Israel could not do what they are doing today or have done for the last 21 months without the staunch support from the US, whether it's military support, diplomatic support, just across the board, you name it. We are. It's not just an Israeli genocide; it's a U.S. Israeli genocide because it wouldn't be possible without the U.S. So there's definitely a public perception shift, but the even the media, I don't want to make some kind of blanket statement like, oh, they're doing much better now. It's not a significant shift. I would still say that overall, the practices that whitewash Israel's crimes are still in place, right? The larger narrative has not changed. The larger way that the media handles things has not changed. But for instance, and this is because I follow, every day I look at the headlines because I'm looking to see how they're presenting the information. And I'll say one thing, for instance, that changes. I see a lot more attribution. There was a period of time where there was you would see headline after headline with no attribution, as if there's just bombs going off in Gaza or things are exploding in Gaza. Hospitals are just, blowing up, and there's no actor that is responsible for those incidents or those events. And I've seen greater use of attribution to Israel's actions, which I think is a positive thing. We've seen, for instance, cases where headlines get updated because they get so much backlash that you'll see like a post from BBC, and then later there'll be an additional post that says this headline, was misleading, so we changed it. So you see headline updates as well. But overall, the ecosystem is the same. The ecosystem is one that treats Israel's actions, treats Israel's statements as fact, treats Israel's actions as justifiable, and dehumanizes Palestinians. That overall narrative is still there. And it's actually really interesting because sometimes you get really important investigative pieces from something like the New York Times or the Washington Post. And I always like to say this because there are individual journalists who are doing a great job, who are trying to. It's not the journalists most of the time that are making editorial calls. I mean, in fact, it's not the journalists ever, but obviously there are journalists at the New York Times who are former IDF soldiers. So you can think of what is the bias of someone that served in the military, stands accused of genocide. And in the case of numerous experts, UN reports, and human rights groups, they are committing genocide. There's no question to it. So there is the question of bias within in specific journalists, but overall, it's the editors that are making these decisions, and it's the institutions that are making these decisions. If certain language is not allowed to be used, it is the institution itself that is saying we are not allowed to use this language. You can look at, there was a report from The Intercept from last year that had a leaked memo from the New York Times. And what did that leaked memo say? There were certain words that they were supposed to avoid using. Words like genocide, occupation, ethnic cleansing, Palestine even. So all of that is that's censorship. I mean, that's what we call it. In any other situation, if we were talking about the press in another country, you would just call that censorship because it's what it is. But we don't use that kind of language to describe our media because our media is supposed to be, remember, it's a free press. And so there are pieces that come out that will show, for instance, the video of the 15 paramedics that were killed by Israeli forces, buried in a mass grave. Their ambulances were crushed and buried in the grave with them. So you have this really important investigative report that comes out for that. Now, what's the problem? Palestinian journalists had been reporting it for days. Like there was a week of reports coming from Palestinians saying, this is what's happened. These paramedics have disappeared. They've been killed. And it wasn't until the UN uncovered the mass grave that finally you saw reporting from Western sources. And that's what I mean when I say even when there's good reporting, there's still this problematic situation in which Palestinians are not taken for their word. The victims of genocide have to basically beg the world to believe that they are being killed by this entity.
Assal, there's so much, that you're doing such important work with this project. Other than all your other work, but this particular thing with the headlines is so important because it reminds us, I've said this for a long time actually, that most of the distortion of the question of Palestine in the US takes place at the level of sentence construction, word choice, grammar, syntax, and so forth. So it's very, as you're showing, it's very subtle. People don't usually think about it because it's so, like, it just comes with the words, and you know, unless you start questioning words and word choice and syntax and grammar, you're just going to absorb it sort of unconsciously. But so there's two things. Well, there's so many things I want to ask you about. Let me just ask you one question for now. We can come back to the other ones in a bit, which is, I mean, you're saying it, we've said it, there is a growing gap between where public perception is, especially in the West, especially in the US. Let's just talk about the US. So there's a growing gap between public perception in the US and these insane newspaper headlines that are so divorced, so meticulously and mendaciously divorced from reality. So one question is, where are people getting their information from, if not from the New York Times? And the second question is, even though, as you just said a minute ago, they sometimes will update or correct, you know, really distorted headlines in order to, you know, hold themselves a little bit accountable to the truth. Why do they go on, you know, engaging in this exercise if fewer and fewer and fewer people take them seriously? I mean, what do you think is going on in their heads? Like, do you think, for example, they believe these things when they craft the headlines in this you know, deliberately misleading way, or do you think they sit down and say, God, how are we going to cover this one? You know, what syntax and grammar are we going to come up with to cover this mass killing of children lined up to get water, for example, as happened yesterday? What do you think is going on there?
I think the reason they continue doing it is because it's not, again, when you look at the institutions that are behind it, these are institutions of power. I mean, the media is a massively powerful entity in the way that it creates public narratives, and to simultaneously promote the idea that we have a free media because that is part of liberal democracy, while that media is actually serving the, you know, the propaganda of the state, is sort of the most genius way of going about things. When you are, because you're building trust within the public by creating this idea that our press is free, but at the same time it's not really acting in that way. So that's why you see the subtlety. The subtlety comes from the fact that it's their way of sort of creating the illusion or the image that it's a free press. And so you have these back and forth debates. There's also internal debates. I mean, you have, for instance, at the BBC, a letter that was just signed by, I think it was like 100 journalists that object to the pro-Israel bias of the BBC. You have people from journalists at CNN and the BBC resigning their positions, quitting their jobs because they're saying there's such a significant pro-Israel bias at these institutions. So you see that there is resistance within the ranks. It's not a monolith where everybody who's at these institutions wants to actually tell the story this way. They want to tell the truth, but they're being blocked from doing so by those who are in positions of power, because those positions of power are connected. I mean, we have to also talk about the fact that it's a corporate media, right? These media outlets aren't just doing a free service for the public. They are for-profit companies. They're meant to get advertising. They want to be connected to positions of power because you want to get the big interview with the politicians and the president, and you have to have the connections to these people to do so. I mean, I'm talking about this, and this has all been explained by, obviously, the book Manufacturing Consent by Herman and Chomsky. I mean, that is, you know, the sort of Bible of trying to understand how in the West the media actually acts as a propaganda wing for the state. What I've tried to do is take concepts from that, because not a lot of people are going to sit and read that book. It's technical, it's academic, it's, you know, it's not something that everyone in the public is going to read. But it's easier when you can see it. It's easier when you can see it, when you can just see something as simple as, because you talked about the subtlety, and the subtlety is the most important part. It's the choice of language. Something as simple as saying, you know, I saw something in Reuters the other day. It was an Israeli strike. They started with Israeli strike, great start, left at least 16 dead. It left them dead. It didn't kill them. It left them dead, whatever that means. I've seen lifeless bodies be used as a euphemism for killed, right? They're not lifeless bodies. They're people who have been killed. They're Palestinians specifically who have been killed. So even the distinction of who has been killed, like the word Gazans, I understand that Gazan is a, you know, a subculture and identity within the larger Palestinian national identity. and that's fine. But the way that it is used in Western media is to compartmentalize Gaza from the West Bank, from East Jerusalem, right? They're West Bank residents, and these are Gazans. But everybody is Palestinian. And it's important to understand that because the cause of Palestinian liberation is under that banner, it's under that flag and that identity, and all of that land is interconnected. So all of these subtle ways are ways that is the reason you see a gap in understanding between public knowledge and the reality on the ground. Now, your first question was that gap is starting to close a bit. And how is that happening? Well, one of the number one reasons is Palestinian journalists on the ground. Palestinian journalists on the ground that are, I mean, you would say risking their lives, but so many have already been slaughtered, losing their lives, being killed for very intentionally. I mean, you cannot, the unprecedented scale of slaughter of journalists in Gaza is not something that is an accident. I mean, you actually have targeted assassinations, even Committee to Protect Journalists, which is very conservative in its use of murder, the murder of journalists versus journalists being killed. Even in that, they've counted numerous cases in which journalists have been murdered in Gaza. So they're being targeted because they're the reason why information is getting out to the world. Israel does not allow foreign press into Gaza, obviously, because they don't want people to know. And that's why they're killing the people who are there, who are telling the stories. The second node of importance is social media. People are seeing these images. And that I think has been the most jarring experience for a lot of people in the Western public who were not aware, who didn't really know, their understanding of this issue was minimal at best, if there was any understanding whatsoever. But the basic understanding was Israel is our ally. Israel is, the Palestinians, or Hamas is a terrorist group. Hamas is representative apparently of all Palestinians. So they're the bad guys and they're the good guys. Like, it's this very basic way of understanding things, but it's hard to digest the idea that the good guys are the ones killing every single day, every single day.
So if I can just jump in, I know Sadi has a follow-up, but a quick question on this. When you say social media, I mean, my understanding of social media, and again, you this is your field, you work in as a journalist, and you work in this. But just can you educate us a little bit in the sense of my understanding of social media is that it feeds a certain community, an algorithm will feed you what it is that you're looking for. So in other words, how do we have a sense of what in other words, are the Zionist sort of people who are watching this, are they being consuming a certain kind of social media that just reinforces their biases as opposed to other people with their biases? Do you see what I'm saying? How do we know that that this is actually making a difference? I guess the fact that there are social media platforms that are in fact showing these images.
Well, the algorithm, to your point, obviously makes a difference. Yeah, there are people who exist in their own ecosystems, and once you start to look for, or once you start to engage with certain material, that is what the algorithm will consistently pull up for you, essentially. But when I say it has an effect, that's where when you look at public opinion polls, there was, I think it was on MSNBC, I forgot what media outlet it was that showed this. There was a swing for young Democrats for basically like positive views of Palestinians that swung, I think it was something like 43 points in the opposite direction.
More. It was like more? 61 points or something. It's incredible. Yeah. I could look up the numbers while you're talking.
Was like what the positive was, and then maybe it was negative, and then that's why the gap is even bigger. That's a massive jump. Overall, the even when you look at like bipartisan polling, the favorability for Israel has gone down quite a bit. I mean, we're looking at decades of polling. If you look at the last 3 decades of polling, this is the worst favorability rating Israel has had in the U.S. And I emphasize that because the U.S. is its number one supporter by far. And the U.S. has like a unique kind of attitude towards Israel. It's, the fact that you have so much overwhelming propaganda in favor of Israel from your political discourse, right, starts from politicians, and it's echoed within the news media, and then it's also echoed within popular culture, right? Popular culture plays a role in all of this as well, because you're getting it from everywhere. When you have that much propaganda being fed to you and still somehow you see these massive shifts, where is the shift coming from? People are seeing things that are different from what they had seen before. So they're seeing it on social media. There's certainly still, yeah, if you are, a pro-Israel account, maybe you're seeing more of your own messaging be reinforced. But you can see these kinds of, and this is anecdotal, but you can see the kind of engagement where they're continuously, I mean, Hezbollah is not a new thing. The fact that the Israeli government actually invests money in, having basically having a propaganda wing, having students on university campuses across the country, paying them to repeat this narrative that Israel has created for itself. That Israel has the right to exist. How many times have we heard that sentence? Over and over again. It's ubiquitous. Everybody has heard the sentence, Israel has the right to exist, because it's repeated by politicians, it's repeated by news anchors, it's repeated over and over again. And that's how propaganda works. That's how it sticks. When you repeat something over and over again, it starts to stick. And no one starts to ask the question, does Palestine have a right to exist? Because no one says that. No one in positions of power say that. That doesn't become the phrase. Israel has the right to self-defense. We hear that over and over again. Israel has attacked, let's talk about the fact that Palestinians have the right to self-defense as well, but Israel has also attacked multiple nation states, multiple sovereign states in the region. Does Lebanon have the right to self-defense? Does Iran have the right to self-defense? Never. It's never a question or a phrase that's brought up. So there's a whole system in place that is meant to repeat a certain narrative. And it's not just what you see in social media. It's what you see. It's when you see an interview that's posted on social media of a politician who's repeating the same things. And this is how it becomes infused in your brain. The fact that perceptions are changing is because they're getting alternate information. And that alternate information is coming through social media, because that's actually where Palestinian journalists are sharing their information. They're sharing it through their own social media platforms. And these get shared everywhere. And people see these images now every day.
As I can ask, there's another form of social media which is now coming from the right wing. So people like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owen and people like this, who have, over the past year or so, sort of, I think at first shyly and then and now quite explicitly talking about the influence that AIPAC or the Israeli lobby or even the politicians in Congress and the Senate, etc., that have in a way that is against American interests and against America kind of as a whole. And these are contributing in their own way to I don't know, demystifying or kind of this kind of the edifice that's cracking a little bit more in terms of the way in which the Israelis are able to control the more mainstream media. How do you see this kind of shift? So there's the kind of pro-Palestine, the social media that is gaining, I think, more, and then there's this right-wing media. How do you see this right-wing media kind of having an influence?
I think it's having a huge influence, because to your point, it's changing and that's why I said it's a bipartisan. It's not just among, young. When you look at the polling for, say, young independent or Democratic voters, that's where you see the generational gap is massive. I mean, question to it. But even when you look at the polling across the board, you see the shift. And I think in part exactly what you pointed to, the fact that you have, for a very different purpose, we should say and clarify, the reasoning behind someone like Tucker Carlson or Candace Owen, why they're questioning it. I mean, someone like Candace Owen will also say she's questioning it because children are being killed. And I do think there is some genuineness to those types of arguments. And I think, we also, in the political discourse that we have in the US, that's become very polarizing. There's this tendency to create caricatures on all sides, the radical left, and then whatever the caricature is of sort of America first and MAGA and that camp. And I think we lose sight sometimes of the fact that the reason why I am the only one, right? People emphasize the scale of death of children. And it is not to say that Palestinian men and women are not being slaughtered on a massive scale and that their lives are not just as precious and just as important. But why the mass slaughter of children? I mean, we're looking at official death tolls of 17,000 children, 27 children a day. A child has been, for 640 days, every hour, more than every hour, a child has been killed. That is an insane scale of killing children. because it hits people in a different way, because you can no longer make any argument or any justification when it's Palestinian men. I mean, essentially Israel has made this point. When you look at the death tolls and then you look at Israel's claims of how many Hamas militants they've killed, it's basically, that means they're considering every man a Hamas militant. That's the only way that the math works out. So these arguments can, even though they're false, can be made. At least you cannot do it with children, even though they try, kind of. Like there's this idea that no one is innocent in Gaza, or these children will be future Hamas terrorists. This is the way that on the Israeli side they're actually talked about. But it doesn't work. It doesn't have the same effect. And I think that's part of, because there's a visceral response that human beings have to children being killed. I mean, when you see a baby.
But as I sorry to interrupt, but I agree with you. For example, on Candace Owen and stuff, especially because she's made the point that she's recently had kids, and so this is something that's. But somebody like Tucker Carlson and those around him, I'm not sure he's. And I'm sure he, as you're saying, everybody I think gets affected by this, but
his approach is different.
His approach is different, and it's more kind of realpolitik, and it's also more. What has this got to do with us, or what is us Americans supporting the Israelis doing this? That's the issue. It's not so much the Israelis doing it, it's why are we supporting them doing this kind of thing? But the idea of manufacturing consent, to go back to manufacturing consent and these kinds of arguments, is the right wing more effective in chipping away because it's something new, as opposed to the more left wing or the more kind of pro-Palestine ones that are more easily said, okay, these are kind of pro-Palestine things, so the algorithms will not go towards more the mainstream. The kind of NBC News, the ABC, these guys will still avoid this, except some individuals here and there. But the right wing, it's a different kind of infiltration, which has quite a large. I mean, Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens have tens of millions of viewers.
I wouldn't say it's more effective at chipping away. I would say it's chipping away at a different group entirely, and that's what makes it broadly more effective. The overall narrative is collapsing because there are areas and groups that you would have assumed 2 years ago would never be having these conversations that are now having these conversations. So on, the left or among students or younger people, these conversations have been going on for a long time. And that's why there's a generational shift. But the fact that, and so that camp has sort of existed and maybe makes inroads only because they draw attention to things when you have something like campus protests. But what you're seeing, the reason why the overall narrative is becoming so different is because you're also seeing it chip away in areas where, I mean, Tucker Carlson will come out and say he's a staunch Israel supporter. This is not someone who is against Israel in any way. And so I think that also hits people in a different way. You've seen this sort of split in the Republican Party and in Trump's own advisors and cabinet and all of that, not just with Gaza, but also just with Israel policy in general. You can see it, for instance, in the way that there was a split very clearly with Israel's attacks on Iran and the fact that the US got involved in that, because that went entirely against the stance of Trump himself, which is, the interventionism is bad. Why are we getting involved in these wars in the Middle East? And all of a sudden, we were seeing a very similar playbook to what we saw in the invasion of Iraq in 2003 playing out, and the potential for a very long war. And even though we have a ceasefire right now, there's no guarantee that anything like that will hold, because the root causes that allowed Israel to attack Iran with zero repercussions or consequences, that all still exists. And if Israel finds itself in a position, and Israel has seen that they can attack as many countries as they want, and there's no international community that will act to stop them. They won't even condemn them. In the case of Iran, somehow the Western world condemned Iran for literally defending itself, for responding to attacks. Iran was condemned. And so when you have this very warped perception of things, there are those who start to question it. And that's where someone like Tucker Carlson comes into it. It's like, well, why are we getting involved in this? Because he does understand a very real fact. It does not benefit the US in any way. It does not. And that's why you saw, like, when you look at a group like Quincy that is funded by people on the left and the right, because there's an intersection between these two sides, which is why are we in constant, endless wars? How does this help the United States? How does it help the ordinary American? It doesn't. This has been proven over and over again. While We've spent trillions of dollars on the war on terror. The quality of life for Americans over the last 2.5 decades has just declined continuously. And so that's where this dissonance is coming from. And that's where you see someone like Tucker Carlson, and why he's effective is because he's just questioning the premise. Because what we don't talk about is how ideologically zealous this position is. That's the ideologically zealous ones are, countries like Iran. They're ideologically zealous in our typical narrative, even though they've been the rational actor. If you look at everything that happened in the last 2 years, every time Israel attacked, every time the US has attacked, the response that you get from the Iranian side is clearly one that is measured to avoid larger escalation, whereas Israel is just starting wars across the region with no concern for civilians being killed, if it's in Lebanon, if it's in Syria, if it's in Iran, if it's in Gaza, if it's in the West Bank. I mean, they're just killing civilians across the region. There's no question to that. But there's starting to be a question of, why are we using our resources this way? How does this benefit the US? Because there is also a backlash. There is deep, deep hatred for Israel in the world right now. Justifiably so. They're committing a genocide. That, by extension, also applies to the United States. And these are the types of things that they're picking up on to say, ultimately, this certainly doesn't serve America first. And it doesn't make any sense. I mean, you had this administration come in, cut jobs, cut funding for cut so much funding that is helpful or beneficial to American people, because they're saying, our budget is too high, we're spending too much money, we need to cut down the waste, but then spent how many billions of dollars to bomb Iran for no particular, when they were negotiating with Iran, when there was a clear solution to whatever, issue that the US has with Iran and its nuclear program. So why is that money being spent in that way? And these are the types of questions that someone like Tucker Carlson is asking, and it's effective because it's true. Like, that's the ultimate point. It is effective because there's truth in it.
But also, if I may, just to follow up with Karim's point about Tucker Carlson, the thing is that there's no empathy for people on the ground in the Middle East. In other words, you mentioned Chomsky and Herman and manufacturing consent. Edward Said, of course, wrote covering Islam and Orientalism. And, Jack Shaheen wrote Real Bad Arabs back in the 70s and 80s. We're talking about books that have long documented this kind of stereotyping, this orientalizing of peoples of the Middle East, especially Muslims, of course, whether Arabs or whether Iranians. So this kind of denigration, this kind of wholesale denigration and vilification of entire cultures, religion, peoples in the Middle East, to what extent is that sort of being chipped away at, as opposed to what you seem to be saying, which is that there seems to be more of a sense of, well, this is not our war, this is not our business. These are two different things. In other words, it's not that there's empathy being built for people on the ground in the Middle East. Or am I wrong? Or do you see that there is a shift? Because, in other words, there was also, I remember with Seti in 1982, after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and the Sabra and Shatila massacre, there was also a kind of a diminishing of Israel's image in the West. But, and then you had decades and decades and decades of more support for Israel. So how do you see these in terms of thinking about it in a slightly longer term?
I don't see, the addressing like dehumanization of Palestinians, and then obviously of the larger Arab and Muslim world, just the region as a whole, is something that is centuries old. As you pointed out, you talked about books that are themselves decades old. Orientalism by Said is really one of the most important texts, I think, of the last century in terms of understanding this process of dehumanization and how this language has been used to justify the exploitation, occupation of peoples throughout the region, which was a project of colonialism. I think when you look at a Tucker Carlson, he's not necessarily chipping away at that. His approach is very, very different. And again, that's why I said, there's differences. I have seen in conservative kind of, even amongst, I'm going to use like comedians as the example, like conservative leaning comedians who will still talk about, like Joe Rogan, someone like that, who will talk about, these are kids being killed. Like, they still use that kind of language. So there is some level of um, understanding and shift, because, and that's why I kept saying the fact that it's children that are being targeted in this way changes the way that people think about things, because children are innocent. I mean, that is the most natural response that we have to things. I mean, look at the Holocaust for a moment. The anti-Semitism and the history of anti-Semitism is quite real, and it led to one of the worst atrocities in human history. It was because of the level and how egregious those atrocities were that there was a massive shift in the societies that where anti-Semitism was bred within the Western world. Right, that's where, I mean, the heart of that's where the Holocaust happened. It happened in Europe. So when you have, and you pointed out, for instance, Sabra and Shatila, yeah, when you have these when people see that, actually, when you can't repeat this narrative of combatant and terrorist, when they're finally humanized, it's hard for the public to ignore that. And I think you see that a little bit on the right and within the conservative sort of camps. But what I think what's driving their messaging is much more politically pragmatic for their own political agendas. On the left and in the center, there's more of that shift in understanding that Palestinians are simply human beings. I mean, it's ridiculous that I have to say that sentence, but there's a lack of public understanding for it. There's a lack of empathy for people who are from the region. There's a lack of empathy for people who are not white, if we're being frank. I mean, there's a lack of empathy. You want to talk about lack of empathy? This is where Black Lives Matter, this is where the phrase Black Lives Matters comes from. Anti-Blackness is something that is pervasive across cultures. So those systems, those racisms are still very much embedded in the way that people think about these groups, whichever groups we're talking about, non-white groups, essentially, non-Western white groups. And I do think that we're seeing that being chipped away at as well, but I wouldn't say that that's the predominant thread on the right, at least.
So sorry, I actually, these are all great points, and obviously we're all on board with you here, but I want to back up a little bit to a point I wanted to come back to. It's a really important book that we all refer to, and you just referred to it a few minutes ago, the book by Herman and Chomsky, Manufacturing Consent. And we use that term, so one way to explain the headlines you're talking about is that this is a project to help manufacture consent. But let me push back a little bit, right? Because that book was written, I think it came out in 1988, late 1980s, I think.
Yeah.
And obviously that was a different universe than the one we're in now. So in other words, the explanation that book gives us helps us understand how the mainstream media manufacture consent, which is their argument. Because basically in 1988 or 1989 or whenever the book came out, if you were a person in DC or New York or Chicago or wherever, somewhere in America, and you wanted to find out what was going on somewhere else, you really had, it wasn't like you had to really work hard to figure out some alternative to ABC News with Peter Jennings or the New York Times or the Washington Post or whatever, right? So now, of course, as we all know, there are, if anything, too many alternatives, right? So I guess what I'm asking is, does that concept of manufacturing consent still work when clearly it's not manufacturing consent? I mean, there isn't consent. That's the whole point. I mean, both my brothers were just asking about the right. We were talking earlier about the left, but neither on the right nor on the left is there anything resembling consent. Rather, what we see is this growing gap between the level. It's almost as though these mainstream media outlets are in a world, they're in a bubble of their own. Like, as far as I can tell, I don't know how this stands up. I mean, you know more about this than I do. Fewer and fewer people are reading these sorts of organizations. Their influence is clearly waning. Economically, we know all these big media companies have been in trouble for some time. That's not a new thing, right? So what is manufacturing consent, this is the question I want to ask, I guess, is manufacturing consent, is that concept from Herman and Chomsky still the right term, or do we need to think of some other way to think through what is happening ideologically in this insistence on clearly false and falsifying forms of representation, even just let alone the stories, just at the level of headlines like you keep focusing on, which is very important, I think. I don't know, do you think manufacturing consent is still an operational concept here? Or do we need to modify it from the age of the 1980s when Herman and Chomsky gave it to us?
That's a great question. It's actually a really fascinating question. I would say a few things. Manufacturing consent, you're thinking of like the way that legacy media operates. But even on social media platforms where all this information is, guess who is trying to the best of their extent, like filter that information? Uh, how many posts that are about Gaza get flagged? How many accounts get taken down? So there is censorship. That same kind of censorship, or the concept within the umbrella of manufacturing consent, is not just happening in the legacy media. It's also happening on social media platforms because those nodes of power are all interconnected. And so in those who are in positions of power are still trying to filter out this information to some extent, to the extent that it's, possible without basically just saying outright being extremely authoritarian, right? We're playing with authoritarianism right now. We haven't gone, it's very different. Like the level to which that authoritarian states and censorship, we're not filtering websites yet. We're not doing things like that. But there is this sort of playing with censorship and what is allowed to be said and what's not allowed to be said. And that's not just happening on mainstream media platforms. It's also happening on those social media platforms. So I would say that there's a deeper concept to me for manufacturing consent, because part of the argument in the book is also that the whole point of it's manufacturing consent for what the state wants to do, for what the government wants to do. And those are still the government policies. So if you look at power and how power is working, it's still working the same way. The policies are the same. They're being made by the same people, even though those people themselves are not necessarily popular. I mean, if you look at our last several elections and why you see political polarization in the United States, it's because we have unpopular people who are constantly running for office, and they're the ones who are holding office. So from the government policies themselves to the legacy media to the people who are the billionaires who own these media platforms, there is still a very concerted and unified effort to maintain the same narratives in order to maintain the same policies. And that's why I still think it's an applicable term, because the narrative is the part where they're still trying to control that narrative in order to have the consent that you're talking about. Also, I would say when you say, the consent is the part that's changing because people are not supporting it. There's always been pushback. Like in every episode of, we tried to manufacture consent for the Vietnam War. There was tons of protests against the Vietnam War. There's always been pushback in these situations. So consent itself is sort of a question, like, what do we mean by consent? The Iraq War, once initially, the reason why Americans supported it was because they had totally false information about what was going on. They believed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. They believed that Saddam Hussein had a role in 9/11, none of which was true. So that's where that language comes from. That was 2003. That's still manufacturing consent, I think. And the other thing I'll say about the book specifically, it did come out in 89 and the 88 or 89, and the political lens that they argued everything was being filtered through was the anti-communist one. Because at the time we were at the tail end of the Cold War, but at the time that was the main sort of narrative. When they updated the book in, I think it was the early 2000s, the lens had changed. It had become, like the war on terror and the sort of war on the Middle East, Islam, the Arab world. That became the new lens through which this was being filtered. And we still see that. And so I think that it's certainly, I think it's relevant in that sense. The other thing I'll say is you're right. There is a growing gap. But if you think about it, one of my friends actually said this to me the other day, and I thought it was such an interesting point. She was like, when are we going to get to the point? How long is it going to be until we get to the point where this is no longer a debate? Like Israel is still you can walk around with Israeli flags very, very easily in the United States. Palestinian flags, you can, but there's the potential for some kind of backlash for it. That's still the environment we exist in, even though Israel is carrying out a genocide. So when are we going to get to the point where it's automatic? Like if you question the Holocaust, you are demonized immediately. When are we going to get to that point? When are we going to get to the point, the way that we talk about slavery? Because it is equally unjust what we are seeing. And yet the fact that, great, there's a gap, that gap is starting to close, but it's still way too much support for genocide. way too much support for genocide. And that's the part where I still think this narrative is still affecting the public in that way. It's still Palestinians, while yes, they're being the narrative is being challenged, we're not near the point that we have to be, where it is automatic. You see an Israeli flag, that's a representation of a state, of an ethno-nationalist state that is now committing genocide. But
It should be like the Confederate flag, exactly.
Exactly, but we're nowhere close to that yet. I don't think, unfortunately.
Assal, I want to, if I can, I want to shift a little bit to talk about Iran. Of course, the Israelis attacked Iran, and the United States bombed Iran. And I guess we're waiting for round two eventually. I mean, I think most people understand that the Israelis are never done with war. They're always going to continue war. They're doing it in Lebanon. They're doing it in Syria. They're doing it everywhere. And I think they're just building up to try to attack Iran again at some point, or to get the US to help it attack Iran. So my question, and you've written so much about it, and you have a book on Iran. Can you just at the beginning just tell us how you think the kind of Iran, sort of the internal Iranian kind of composition in society, how they reacted to this war? Sort of so we know about the division before, or at least in very superficial terms in any case. How has the war affected internally? I mean, we hear stories that now nationalism has been ramped up, support for the government and the regime has kind of ramped up. There's a defensiveness. Is this true? Do you see this as true, and do you see this as just something very temporary, or is it carrying forward? How do you assess kind of Iranian society after this war, or after the attack anyway?
I wouldn't say that it ramped up support for the government. I would say that it ramped up support for the nation. And those are theoretically two different things. A rallying around the homeland effect, where, and you brought up my book. That's one of the things. That's one of the sort of arguments that I made in the book back in 2020. Well, I mean, I wrote the book before that, but when it was published in 2022. Iranian society is highly nationalistic, and the national symbols that they use vary. There's because Iran has a vast history. There's a lot of symbols that they can pull from, whether it's all the way back to the Achaemenid Empire, Cyrus the Great, and Persian dominion and Persian Empire, or religious symbols, especially religious symbols that come from Shiaism, the story of the martyrdom of Imam Hussein. All of that is infused within Iranian culture. And the Iranian psyche is one of a nation, even though obviously it's ahistorical because nation states are new. They're only a couple centuries old, but there is within the psyche of the Iranian, it is a 2,500-year-old nation. That is a nation that is, I mean, you hear this all the time from Iranians, the oldest country in the world. We can argue about the historical accuracy of those types of statements, but again, it's less important than the way that they have developed a consciousness about the nation itself. And so what you saw was not surprising at all. It's actually surprising to me that people still try to use the argument that we're going to bomb them into freedom. It's the most bizarre argument that's been made. It's been made over and over again, and it never works because people don't want to actually be bombed. And even though you saw an attempt in the sort of diaspora, within the diaspora politics, to try and justify Israel's attacks, you didn't see that response within the country. I don't think that it has changed any of the grievances, the very legitimate grievances that people hold against the government. That has stayed the same. And what you've seen the government do is what they've done many times before. They tap into these sort of nationalist sentiments in order to protect themselves as well. Because when the nation had to be defended, obviously this is who has to defend it. There's no one else to defend it. And that becomes an important point. Initially, they were actually very angry because Israel's initial attack was massive. It was a huge attack, and there didn't seem to be much of a defense being put up. It wasn't until they started to mount a defense and actually hit Israel back in kind that you saw more civilian deaths on the Iranian side, more attacks on clearly civilian infrastructure, that you saw a growing unity that was against what Israel was doing. And I think there is also a very simple fact that people can hold multiple views at once. Another thing I never understand, why people, in like the way that it's talked about in the public, as if you either have to be for the government or against the government to also be for or against the country being bombed. And that's not the case. You can have very complicated feelings towards your own state, towards your own government, and at the same time, very complicated feelings about what is happening. To my mind, it is not even mildly surprising. I don't know of any state anywhere that would welcome being bombed, would welcome their civilians being killed, would welcome their streets being blown up, which is what we saw happening. So it's just another episode in the sort of Western imperial thinking, including Israel, because it's a Western colony, that indicates this total disconnect between reality. I mean, you saw Netanyahu use the same language with the Iranians that he did with Lebanon. He did the same thing with Lebanon. He said, rise up against Hezbollah. My war is not with the Lebanese people. Kill thousands of Lebanese people, but my war is not with the Lebanese people. So that's language gets used over and over again. Netanyahu, mind you, I think we should always remember, back in 2002, gave testimony to Congress to encourage the US to promote the idea that Saddam Hussein was developing weapons of mass destruction, to encourage the US to preemptively strike and go to war with Iraq. And in it, when he was giving that testimony, we always focus on the Iraq part, but he's also talking about Iran. He also talks about, well, what's the way, Iran is the ultimate goal, but this is where we start, because when the Iranian people see the liberation of Iraq, then, you'll see positive reverberations throughout the region. Of course, none of that actually happened. It's the same language. I mean, we're 2 decades later, and he's using the exact same language. And it just doesn't work because even if people wanted to, there's another aspect to it. Even if people wanted to politically organize, how can they politically organize when they're being bombed? What do you want them to do? They're trying to flee for their lives. You're telling 10 million people to flee a city, but then also rise up with what? Like, none of it actually makes any sense. So I think, Sari asked the question earlier, like, why, you asked it about these media platforms, like, why do they keep doing it? Like, who believes this, basically? Politicians do it all the time. I always ask that question. I'm like, who believes this? When you make this statement, who believes you when you say, we're here to liberate you? But they still do. I mean, whether it's they're stuck in their own minds or they think this is effective is a question for the people who keep doing it.
Well, it's a 200-year track record of Western imperialists telling people in the Middle East that we're here to liberate you. We're here to liberate you, from Napoleon all the way on. But I want to follow up on Karim's question, Assal, if I may, in terms of the Iranian sort of reaction to this. And you're saying there's a rallying around the flag or nation effect, you said, and that it's sort of ludicrous for the propaganda that's being directed at Iran about overthrowing the regime, et cetera, in the middle of a war. But isn't there something, I mean, isn't there this idea of liberals in Iran, or a whole section of the Iranian sort of public or social fabric, both in exile, but also obviously in Iran itself, that still have this idea that somehow, our issue, we can have good relations with the US despite decades and decades of sanctions placed on Iran. And that sense that that's what's being played on, this West toxification. Of course, that's a term that's familiar to you. And maybe you can explain that. I mean, what is that? How does that play into this whole this situation? In other words, the US bombed Iran, but what I heard the Iranian president on Tucker Carlson's interview, he was appealing directly to the Americans, saying, our issue is not with the United States. So again, maybe is this realpolitik? Is this just like intelligent diplomacy? What is it? But what about this idea of the sense of there's still this belief that the West is where Iran wants to be associated with?
There's certainly a sentiment within the country. I mean, taking a step back, it's a gigantic country. It's a country of 90 million people. There's no group that is representative of the entire country. There's certainly no individual that can do that. People have across the board, across the political spectrum, diverse political views from, one extreme where they're the base of support for the Islamic Republic itself, like the system that currently exists, is a minority, but still represents several millions of people. Then you have the other extreme, which is at any cost a willingness. I mean, there were people who were happy that Israel was bombing Iran inside of Iran. I'm not saying that those people don't exist. I'm saying they're a minority, right? So it's not a question of, are there people that have these sentiments? It's a question of, is this the predominant view? And the predominant view was one that was, yes, we can have grievances and be against our own government, but at the same time be against this. That was the predominant view. In terms of wanting to pivot towards the West, when you think about the history of Westernization and West toxification, as you said it, the idea of emulating the West and being like the West, this is, I think, pervasive in many parts of the world, and that's simply because of Western power. It's not unique to Iran in that sense. But I think there's a very pragmatic reason behind it as well. It's because they know that their access to the world will not, their isolation will continue as long as Iran is under massive sanctions, as long as there's maximum pressure from the United States. Just consider this fact. After the JCPOA, after the US withdrew from the JCPOA, technically, Europe.
What is the JCPOA for those who?
Sorry, the Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is where the JCPOA comes from, but it was the Iran nuclear deal that was an international agreement back in 2015 that the Obama administration negotiated with Iran to limit its nuclear program, to ensure that it was a civilian nuclear program and not a weaponized program. One of the reasons why Iranians celebrated that so much was specifically because of the US. It was the fact that the US and Iran were able to actually negotiate and have diplomatic relations, not resuming diplomatic relations, but some kind of non-combatant way of interacting with one another. So this was like a huge celebration for Iran because it was for Iranians, because it was the idea that it was bringing them out of isolation. It's not just a pivot towards the West, but it's the fact that it's the West that helps isolate them to that extent. They don't want to be isolated. They want to be part of the rest of the world. I think that's a fairly, and not everyone, not everyone. There are some people in the country who probably like to be isolated because they have a way of life that they want to preserve, and that's what they want. Again, that's a minority view. Predominantly, this is a highly educated, like metropolitan population. They want to be able to travel freely. They want to be able to open businesses. They want to be able to have investments come in. They want basic concepts, right? Instead of an economy that has erased the middle class, an economy that builds up a middle class. Those things are what's tied to a very pragmatic idea that is not a pivot towards the West, but the need for some kind of detente with the West. And I think that's why you see, even after being attacked, I mean, they're very aware of their situation. I mean, the asymmetry of power, it's one of the reasons why it's so funny the way that Iran is talked about in the West as if it's this massive threat to the United States. It's absurd. Of course, it's not a threat to the United States. The asymmetry of power is nowhere close. I mean, Iran has been under US sanctions that the US itself boasts about having crushed their economy. Iran can't do that in kind. Iran cannot respond in kind. The reason why Iran's response to the US attacks is this measured, like making sure no one gets hurt, is because they don't want to escalate, because they know there's an asymmetry of military power as well. So they pivot towards diplomatic resolutions because it's politically pragmatic to do so.
On this question of the war, the recent, the Israeli attack on Iran, the Iranian response, the American, I don't know what you make of the American raid on Iran afterwards, and then as you just said, the Iranian counterstrike on the U.S. base. Do you did you detect anything in the headlines that's like, is it parallel to how the headlines distort what's happening in Palestine?
Oh yeah.
Is it a different version of the same thing? Is it exactly the same thing? How did you track the headlines?
It's pretty much exactly the same thing, I would say. I mean, Iran is.
So bombs fall from sky over Tehran, but it wasn't like that, was it?
It wasn't a lack of attribution to that. To your point on that, but for instance, there wasn't a lot of reporting on Iranian civilian deaths. There wasn't a lot of like when Iranian hospitals were bombed. Where was the reporting? An Israeli hospital got bombed. That got a lot of reporting. That was after 2 Iranian hospitals had been bombed. There was just no reporting. So there wasn't, hospital in Tehran or hospital in Kermanshah gets hit, there was just no headline whatsoever about it. Or there was very, very few. Like I found one in like the Helsinki Times, there was very little coverage about those types of attacks. So there's definitely that underreporting of what is happening on the Iranian side and over-reporting of what is happening on the Israeli side. So Israeli civilian deaths get massive amounts of coverage, even though the scale is so asymmetric. I mean, there are estimates of between 900 and 1,100 Iranians that were killed. I think the civilian death toll for Israel stood at 35, if I'm not mistaken. But I mean, massively different scale, and yet one side gets coverage and the other side doesn't. But when I say it's the same, I mean in terms of the framing. I mean, for instance, in the case of Gaza, when a hospital gets hit, how does the Western media frame it? They were targeting a Hamas leader. So they're trying to justify it. The headline is not, this is an egregious violation of international law. It doesn't use emotive language to describe the victims in hospitals that are Palestinian. It tries to justify it as like a legitimate military strike. That's precisely the kind of language that you saw in describing the Iranian strikes. So very initially, you saw language of the use of preemptive strike. Preemptive strike implies that there was an imminent threat. What they're doing is they're just taking Israel's statements and they're repeating it. Israel says it was a preemptive strike. And so this is how it's being presented. When Iran retaliates, the word retaliation is often not used, even though it's a retaliation. So it seems like Iran is the aggressor when you look at these headlines. There were headlines very clearly where if Israel said, Israel warns, that was the word that was used, Israel warns people that they're going to be, they have to evacuate. Iran threatens. This is the difference in the language that's used. So in that sense, yes, it's a parallel because, again, Israel clearly violated international law, clearly violated Iran's sovereignty, clearly targeted, even though they said they weren't targeting civilian sites, killed hundreds of civilians. There's video of, Tadrish. There's the video of an insane explosion in the middle of, this is like a main street in Iran's, not just in the city where so many people live, but also for commerce. It's like a huge residential commercial area. You see the street explode. So that got basically no coverage. And yet, a hospital being attacked in Israel, mind you, there was, I think was it an intelligence site? There was something that was very close to the hospital, which was what Iran was actually targeting. The same thing, the same human shield language that is used to justify Israel's attacks on all of Gaza. I mean, the entire enclave has been destroyed based on the idea that, well, Hamas was there, but Israel's military headquarters, Israel's intelligence offices, they're also where civilians are, because that entire argument was always ridiculous. Like the human shields argument was just meant to justify the slaughter of Palestinians. Where is the Pentagon? It's not in some secret underground bunker. It's in the middle of DC. So it showed again in another scenario how Israel's actions are whitewashed. Israel's actions are always justifiable. And even a retaliation against an Israeli aggression is seen as the bad actor, or they're the problem. Then you saw so many, like, not just op-eds, but actual headlines about Netanyahu's victory, like how amazing Israel's attacks were. Like, it's unbelievable. Not only are they not condemning or contextualizing Israel's attacks as a violation of international law, they're applauding it in the media. So, yeah, I mean, in many ways, I think it paralleled it.
I mean, from my extremely unscientific observations, I've found that there was a lot less sympathy for the Israelis in the attack on Iran, even by those that would otherwise not particularly care about Iran, including on the right wing. To go back to Tucker Carlson and these people, but I found that there was quite a bit of I don't know, joy is the wrong word, but there was a sense by a lot of people across the world, not necessarily in the United States, that the Israelis got what they deserved in terms of the attacks. And I think I felt was a little bit different in that kind of way. I wanted to ask
you mean
sort of final question. In public perception. Yeah,
I agree with you 100% on that. And we can talk about that because
yeah.
that's actually a fascinating point in and of itself. Finish your
No,
understand.
please, actually, because I was going to ask you about something else related, but if you want to resolve, because I do think it's an interesting point. So
Because so right now we were talking about the media's right, the legacy media's framing. The legacy media's framing, I think, was quite parallel. I mean, Iran is the bad guy. Iran has a unique position as being a bad guy, especially in Western media, because of the embassy seizure of 1979 and obviously the entire psyche. I mean, we don't want to get into all of that, but Iran is always the bad guy in Western media. And so that part of it is, I would say, is the parallel. In terms of public perception, you're absolutely right. And it was fascinating because like I saw, and again, this is not scientific, but where I'm pulling on the sort of like surveying the way that people are talking about things. The idea, if you told me 2 years ago that you would have the types of commentary online about Israel attacking Iran and Iran responding, I would never have believed you. Because there was, I mean, it was almost comedic. The type people had brought back tweets from Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader, who's not a popular figure in Iran and obviously a problematic human being in many, 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 many ways. So the fact that you have this public perception of people who might not know all of that, right? They're not privy to all of this information. They haven't followed or studied Iran. They're just looking at it now through the lens of Israel. And that was what was so interesting about it. Iran was the good guy in this situation simply because Israel was the one that attacked them. And in this case, it was, the framing of the Gaza genocide is that it's a response to October 7th. That's framed, of course, because everyone ignores everything before October 7th. It was a ceasefire on October 6th. If Palestinians being killed every day doesn't count for anything, if occupation that's decades old doesn't count for anything, if Palestinians' lives don't matter, then sure, there was a ceasefire on October 6th, but there wasn't, right? So that's the framing of it. There is no similar framing that could have been used in the case of Iran. It was just an attack by Israel. And so I also think that's what, and this is now on the heels of, 20 months of genocide, on the heels of a war that they started in Lebanon. And now after all of that, when you look at all of that and then you see the response, that's why I think you see a very different public response. And there was so many posts on social media that pointed this out, that said that were, in sort of as like a parody, pointing out how bad Israel's PR situation has to be, that people are now Americans, right? Ordinary people are, to your point, almost cheering on the IRGC, which is a designated terrorist organization in the US, ridiculous in and of itself, but for a different day, because of everything that Israel has done. So the public perception on that, you're absolutely right, was completely reversed, unlike what the media was doing.
yeah, I totally agree, and I think there was great relief and kind of happiness in the sense that the Israelis had been hit, and for once they kind of got a bit of their own medicine in this way. I know we need to wrap, but I just want to ask a question related to Iranian media or Iranian society understanding of the region itself. So this question of support for Hezbollah, for example, for Hamas to an extent, but Hezbollah in particular, what can you just very briefly explain how this has evolved in the sense of this, we hear about a lot of that there's this kind of mix between, on the one hand, the IRGC fully supporting, on the other hand, the vast majority of people totally against support for Hezbollah and support for the kind of wider axis of resistance. Can you just explain the way this is represented and the way it actually is in this relationship?
Well, Iranian media is obviously not a free press, and so there's not. I mean, there are reformist papers in the print aspect of it. You'll see diversity of views. Sometimes those, especially if they go too far off the rails, those newspapers will get shut down. So in print, you have more diversity of view. In media, in like actual like television, within Iran itself, there is no diversity of views. The diversity of views comes from satellite TV, which is basically foreign based, and that's being streamed into the country. In terms of the state line is obviously that this is their foreign policy. Their foreign policy is to support groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, the axis of resistance, in part as a defensive posture for themselves, and in part because this is in terms of the narrative of the Islamic Republic, this is, resistance culture is very much part of their nationalist rhetoric. And so they support resistance movements within the region, and groups like Hezbollah and Hamas are seen as resistance to, why do they exist? Hamas exists because of the occupation. Hezbollah exists because of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. So these are reactions to Israeli aggression. And this way that the Islamic Republic tries to use that language to say that they are representative of that kind of like resistance within the region. Now, what is the public view? While a lot of Iranians might sympathize with Palestinians and might be very critical of Israel and the United States and policies that they have carried out, they are also very critical of their own government. So there's a lack of trust. When there's a lack of trust in your own government, you basically hate everything that they do just because you don't trust them. Think about, vaccines in the US, and when you don't trust your own government, you won't even do something that's good for you. Think about something like that. So they don't trust their own government. They don't like their policies. But there's another aspect to it. And this is something I think that we can very easily relate to, especially if you're sitting in a country like the United States. There is a strong grievance towards using resources, spending money on when it's limited, right? When so many Iranians are suffering, when so many Iranians are struggling, on what we would call, adventurism, on why are we spending it in Lebanon? Why are we spending it on Palestinians? Why isn't this not being spent here? It's a very sort of, the America First like attitude. Like, why are our resources being distributed in this way? And so that's a very strong grievance that is predominant within that society. And so again, you can see that there's this sort of subtlety where on one hand, they might have sympathy with those people, but not wanting their resources to be used in this way. And I think that's a strong grievance that you've seen. And this goes back. If you look at the protests in 2009 in Iran, during the Green Movement, one of the phrases that was used and has been used since then is no to Lebanon, no to Gaza, I give my life for Iran only, right? So there's this very nationalist, we should be focused on our own people, our own issues kind of attitude that comes in the public perception of these issues.
But surely that must have also that must have changed with the Israeli bombing of Iran, or maybe not. Am I?
I don't think I can assess that. I think that maybe what you see is an uptick in criticism of Israel. If there was maybe some sympathies with Israel because of how much they detest their own government and their own government policies, once Israel attacked them, once Israel started killing their civilians, once Israel started, entire apartment buildings were crumbling to the ground, there's likely an uptick in understanding, okay, they're not really here. They're not really here to help us at all. And so there might be, and I say might because I just don't have like the data to back it up. This would be entirely anecdotal. But there certainly seems to be some kind of like grievance towards Israel's actions. Again, I don't think that translates necessarily into now we support, you spending billions of dollars on Hezbollah or Hamas or any of these things. That those two things I don't think are necessarily have to coexist. I think they can be more critical of Israel and still be critical of their own government and the way that their resources are used.
Okay. Well, on that note, Assal, thank you so much for your time, for your patience, for your wisdom, for your explanations of what has been happening both here in the media in the US and, of course, the situation in Iran. And again, thank you for all the work that you do.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This was a great conversation, and you guys gave me a lot of things to think about myself.
Thank you, Assal.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, guys, what did you think of that really excellent interview with Assal Rad? I thought was she really sort of touched on all sorts of topics: the history, the Chomsky, the manufacturing consent, the situation today. Kenny, let's start with you. What did you think?
No, I agree. I think it's. I think it's funny that something that appears to be so simple as just taking, it's at least some of the stuff that we talked about at the beginning, and a lot of what she's been working on, which is simply taking headlines. And for those who don't know her or haven't been following her, please make sure you go on X and these other forums and follow, because it's something as simple as taking a headline of the New York Times or something and simply kind of Xing it and putting in the proper words that actually make sense. It seems so simple and so obvious to us, but it makes such a massive difference when you read these sentences or read the headlines into how it affects you, how you're able to respond and deal and engage with the actual subject matter. So, and whether you have empathy or you don't have empathy, it's incredible how much a headline might make that kind of difference if you didn't know any better. I mean, imagine if we're reading about something in some area or some country that we know nothing about. I mean, the headline would make a very, very big difference. So I thought that's that's
Actually, Karim,
amazing work. Yeah.
on that point, part of so much of Assad's, I mean, the work she's doing, all of the work she does, but like the headline thing in particular, because it's, as you say, it's so small. In other words, it's so focused. It's so, this is all you need to know is to understand how the distortion takes place. And here it is in these very, very clearly calculated headlines that are designed to distort and not to represent accurately, or to cover as opposed to covering. To cover up as opposed to covering. To use the other word for cover, the other meaning of the word covering. But it's also striking and she does some of this too in some of the other work she's done, when you put the headlines on Gaza next to the headlines on Ukraine, because these two episodes have been happening roughly concurrently, more or less. And so, it's like the New York Times headline, Russia bombs Ukrainian hospital, whereas in Gaza, bomb falls from sky as, people die as bomb falls from sky. It's
the question.
Those things, seeing them in parallel is so powerful, I think.
But let me ask you, how, I mean, is this different? I mean, we've been talking about this for decades. I mean, we grew up with this kind of stuff. So is it just that the extent of what's going on, the fact that there's a genocide, that's what's different? Or
no,
is something changed?
Something has changed. And that's why I was trying to push back a little bit on this question of manufacturing consent, because I think the Chomsky-Herman argument, as influential as it was, really worked in a different era because people are no longer consenting. That's kind of the point. If you look around, and we talked about this literally in our last episode, or the one before maybe, where we were talking about what's been all of the public opposition to what's going on to the Holocaust in Gaza. It's so clear that there's a massive gap between most people, many people, a preponderance of people, a plurality of people, certainly most Democratic people in the U.S., even a lot of Republicans, by the way, too. And not just the hard right people like the Tucker Carlsons and those guys, but just sort of normal Republicans, too, are outraged at seeing what's happening. And as you know, 2/3 of Americans have consistently been calling for a ceasefire, basically from day one, essentially, through Biden and now into Trump, too. So I think, and that is different. When Herman and Chomsky wrote the book in the late 80s, that was a moment when, as I said, as to Assal, like I remember people would go to flipping Peter Jennings to find out what's happening in the world. And what else were you going to do other than that? That you couldn't, like, what are you going to get, a telegraph from somebody? I remember Edward back in the day he would have to have friends sending him stuff from Palestine to know what's happening there. You had to have alternative sources of information, but now we're in a totally different era. And consent has broken. There is no longer consent. On the question of Palestine, there is no consent in Western societies, which is why Western societies are in such
power
crisis.
Structures are. I mean, so it's manufactured consent among politicians and...
Yeah, but they don't need to have consent. That's the whole point. The whole Chomsky argument is that the powerful states need to exercise hegemony rather than dominance, and sort of cajole their publics into supporting them, through all of the means that Chomsky and Herman talk about in that important book. They don't do that anymore. Now, like, if you disagree, you're going to have your degree withheld by thus and such university, or you're going to be, you're going to lose your, as a band in the UK did, you're going to lose your contract, and you're going to. These like the means that are being used now to enforce the line, to hold the line, what's left of the line on Palestine in Western society is punishment. It's no longer consent. It's discipline and punish, rather than hegemony and sort of accepting and consent and common sense and all those kinds of Gramscian concepts. So I think that's why I think we are in a different era. which is again why I was asking Assal, like, what is the point of this? Like, why does the New York Times go on with this fiction? Who's reading this stuff anymore? Who believes this stuff anymore?
Well,
Of course, I don't know the answer to that
a lot of
question.
people,
No,
a lot of people
yeah.
believe
I
it.
suppose,
a lot
yeah,
of
but
people,
I don't know who they are, but yeah,
No, sorry.
I
The
guess.
circles in New York and Washington and
Yeah, okay.
London
That's
and these
the
are
echo
people that are
chamber.
making
Okay, fine.
Yeah, but the decision makers. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's no longer consent. That's my point. There's no
Yeah.
longer public consent. That's been broken, and that's why I think we're in a different era now. And her work shows that, I think, very, very clearly.
Yeah.
Sama, what did you think, since you're the official historian here?
No, I thought it was very impressive. I thought she is very impressive. I think her work is impressive. I think her work is important. I think I agree with both of what you guys said. I just think that the question of the gap between public perception and, on the other hand, a genocide is not something that's going to actually stop the genocide. And then the question is, are we going to all wring our hands collectively after the fact? You know, is that what's going to happen in a few years' time when all is said and done, when the Palestinians have been obliterated in Gaza and ethnically cleansed? Is that when people are going to say, "Oh, this was terrible and should not have happened"? I mean, this is where we are right now. So let's see what
No,
happens.
sorry,
But thank you both.
Sorry, just to push back on this.
Please.
I think you're going against what we've been saying, which is that there is. I mean, society just gave a whole thing about how there is not consent. That on the contrary,
No, there
there's
isn't
been.
consent. I agree. There's no consent.
But
My
you're
point
saying
is that,
But you're saying, are we going to look back later and say, oh, we.
I mean, I meant to say. Let me clarify. That's a good point you're making, Karim. I mean to say those empower the establishment. The way they today they wring their hands and they say, "Oh my God, what happened in the 19th century or racism was terrible." Blah blah blah. And here we have in the 21st century unfolding before all our eyes,
And in certain academic circles too.
And in academic circles, even though even in academic circles, it's becoming less and less. Even as the genocide escalates and escalates, it gets less and less tenable to defend it. Publicly, at least, but in the end, they don't need to.
Just parenthetically, has that shifted?
Has what shifted?
In these academic circles that you and Sari are, especially in California and kind of America in general, has there been a shift for those
those that
you would expect, in the kind of liberal, etc. These guys, and the anti-colonial, anti-racism, feminist, all this kind of stuff. Have they shifted? Of course, they're good individuals, but sort of as a collective.
Karim, it's actually it's hard. I would say it's hard to say because the atmosphere on our campuses has become so repressive. It's difficult. People don't say anything anymore. I mean, it's not literally, but that's kind of the direction we're going in. And Trump has come in with his witch hunts and so forth, which are just building on the Biden era witch hunts before them too. By the way, I don't know. I think it's difficult to say what's happening anymore on campuses other than this mass repression. But I think when it comes to, this is what we talked about in the last couple of episodes, including the one with Ilan Pape last week too. This idea that right now the massive shift that we're witnessing in Western societies right now won't be enough in and of itself now to save people in Gaza, unfortunately. But in the long run, it has epoch-making consequences. I think that's still true.
And in the meantime, we all have our ethical responsibility to speak out against genocide.
Yes, to do what we can, exactly. To go on protesting and writing and doing everything that we're doing. Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah.
Well, thank you guys.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.